The retired officer had been waiting for this moment for a long time. After decades of walking the streets of a busy city, dealing with danger, injustice, and constant stress, he had finally managed to find a place where he could breathe, relax, and live life on his own terms. A small cabin tucked into the woods far from the rush of the city offered him the peace he had dreamed of. The air was crisp. The sound of birds singing in the trees replaced the blaring sirens he had become used to, and the gentle rustle of leaves in the wind became his new soundtrack. Here he could sit on the porch with a cup of coffee in the morning, watch the sun rise, and just be. He had chosen this cabin carefully. It wasn't fancy or modern, but it was sturdy, comfortable, and surrounded by nature. He loved the feeling of isolation, the sense that he was truly away from the world that had been so harsh for so many years. Still, he wasn't entirely alone. A few neighbors lived nearby, each with their own cabins, and over time he had grown familiar with them. Some were friendly and easy to talk to, while others were quiet and kept to themselves. The retired officer didn't mind. He enjoyed the occasional chat and wave, but mostly he cherished his solitude. The cabin had a little garden he tended to in the mornings, planting flowers and herbs, and sometimes vegetables. He liked the routine, the slow and steady work of nurturing plants. It gave him a sense of accomplishment that was different from the rush of catching criminals or solving crimes. Here his victories were small but meaningful: a tomato ripening, a flower blooming, a bird nesting nearby. They all became little moments of joy he could savor. But living in a neighborhood meant dealing with rules, and this neighborhood had plenty. The Homeowners Association, or HOA as they were commonly called, was strict. They had regulations about how lawns should look, what colors houses could be painted, and even what kind of decorations were allowed. For most people, these rules were a minor annoyance. For the retired officer, they were an occasional source of irritation, but he tried to stay compliant. He believed in following rules, and after spending decades enforcing laws, he had little patience for unnecessary conflict. Still, he had learned that some neighbors loved to enforce the rules more zealously than others. One neighbor in particular had made a name for herself in the community. She was known for being overbearing, always keeping a close watch on everyone, and quick to report any perceived violation to the HOA. People in the neighborhood quietly called her Karen. She had been in the community only a short while, but had already made herself notorious. Her reputation was that of someone who loved authority and enjoyed exercising it whenever possible. She kept a close eye on the properties around her and didn't hesitate to involve HOA security if she felt something was out of place. The retired officer had noticed her, watching his property from across the street. At first he ignored it, thinking she would get bored eventually. But one day, he noticed her taking pictures of his cabin and writing notes on a clipboard. He had a feeling that trouble was brewing, but he also knew how to handle it. He wasn't easily intimidated, and he had decades of experience in dealing with confrontations. On this particular day, he was outside, checking his garden and enjoying the warm sun when he saw her again. She was speaking on her phone, pointing at his cabin and making exaggerated gestures. His instincts, honed from years on the streets, told him that she had probably called someone to intervene. Sure enough, later that afternoon, he noticed two unfamiliar men in uniform slowly driving past his cabin, their eyes scanning his property. They had the look of private security guards, and they were clearly trying to appear official. The retired officer didn't panic. He had seen plenty of people like this in his career, people who liked to assert authority without really having it. He finished tending to his garden, keeping an eye on the approaching vehicles, and then went inside to prepare a cup of tea. He believed in staying calm and measured. There was no need for rash action, and he had learned over the years that patience often worked better than confrontation. Still, he made sure his phone was nearby just in case. It wasn't about being afraid. It was about being prepared. As the security guards reached his gate, the retired officer stepped outside. He was calm, collected, and confident, wearing his usual casual clothes, a simple shirt and jeans. He greeted them politely, though he could tell they were trying to hide their unease. The taller of the two spoke first, introducing themselves as security personnel sent by the HOA to check on the property. Their tone was polite but firm, as if they expected him to be intimidated. The retired officer listened carefully and then asked them to explain the reason for their visit. He spoke slowly and clearly, giving them no room for misunderstanding. The guards mentioned that there had been complaints about suspicious activity, vague enough to be meaningless but serious enough for them to feel they had to act. The retired officer raised an eyebrow but kept his voice calm. He told them that everything on his property was fully compliant with HOA rules, that he had no intention of causing any trouble, and that he expected them to respect his privacy and rights. He could sense the guards' discomfort. They were used to people being nervous or scared, but here was someone who was calm, confident, and clearly used to handling situations. They shifted uneasily, glancing at each other, unsure how to proceed. The retired officer didn't pressure them, didn't yell or threaten. He simply stated facts and maintained control of the situation with his presence. That alone made them hesitant. Meanwhile, Karen watched from a distance, clearly frustrated. She didn't expect someone to respond so calmly and effectively. In her mind, she had already prepared a script of confrontation, imagining the retired officer panicking or apologizing for imaginary infractions. She could not understand that he was unbothered, unshaken, and fully capable of handling any overreach on her part. The retired officer noticed her across the street but chose to focus on the immediate situation. He kept his eyes on the security guards, making sure they understood that he was not an easy target. At the same time, he began recording the interaction on his phone, not for threat or revenge, but for documentation. He had learned long ago that clear records often prevented misunderstandings and protected the innocent. As the conversation continued, the retired officer subtly hinted at his experience in law enforcement. He didn't boast, didn't flaunt his credentials, but he made it clear that he knew his rights and understood procedures. That alone caused the guards to hesitate even more. They were private security, trained to follow instructions but not experienced in law enforcement tactics or legal boundaries. They were beginning to realize that they might be stepping into a situation more serious than they had anticipated. The retired officer also reached out to a friend, another retired officer, to be on standby. He didn't need help, but having someone nearby provided an extra layer of security. It was a precaution, a way to ensure that the situation remained safe and controlled. He knew that experience mattered, that calm preparation mattered, and that sometimes the mere presence of someone knowledgeable could prevent unnecessary conflict. As the sun began to set, the tension was noticeable, but the retired officer remained calm, composed, and dignified. He wasn't angry or vengeful. He was simply protecting his peace, his property, and his rights. Karen could fume all she wanted. He knew the truth of his situation, and that gave him strength. He had lived through much worse, had faced danger, and had handled situations that would have shaken ordinary people. Compared to those experiences, this was minor, and he treated it as such. By the end of the day, the retired officer had made it clear to the security guards that he would not be intimidated, that his property was his, and that any further actions needed to follow proper legal procedures. The guards left awkward and unsure, leaving the retired officer alone on his porch sipping his tea, watching the sky turn shades of orange and pink as the sun disappeared behind the trees. He felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing he had handled the situation with skill, patience, and grace. The woods were peaceful again, and he could finally relax, at least for now, knowing that he had defended his solitude without unnecessary confrontation. The next morning, the retired officer woke up to the soft sound of birds chirping outside his cabin window. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the earthy smell of the forest. He poured himself a cup of coffee and stepped onto the porch, taking a moment to enjoy the quiet. The previous day had left a lingering sense of tension, but he refused to let it spoil his peace. Life had given him many challenges, and he knew how to handle them. Today would be no different. He began his routine, checking his small garden and making sure everything was in order. The flowers were blooming, and a few vegetables were beginning to show promise. Gardening had become a therapeutic habit for him, something that helped him focus on growth, patience, and care rather than confrontation. But as he worked, he noticed movement across the street. Two uniformed figures were slowly walking along the road, glancing at his cabin and occasionally whispering to each other. The retired officer's instincts immediately picked up on their presence. They were the same security guards from yesterday, and they seemed to be returning. He didn't panic. Instead, he calmly observed them from a distance, making mental notes of their positions and behavior. He poured himself another cup of coffee, leaning against the porch railing, keeping his movements relaxed but aware. His eyes, trained over decades of patrolling dangerous streets, picked up details others might have missed. He could tell they were trying to appear nonchalant, but their tension was obvious. They were uncertain, unsure how to approach him, and that was an advantage he intended to use wisely. As the guards got closer, the retired officer called out to them, his voice steady and neutral. He asked what they were doing and if they had any official reason for being on his property. The taller of the two hesitated, glancing at his partner before answering. They mentioned that they had been sent by the HOA to ensure compliance and investigate complaints. The retired officer listened patiently, nodding slowly as if taking their words seriously. He could see their discomfort, their lack of confidence growing with each passing moment. He decided to take control of the conversation without raising his voice or showing anger. He explained that his property was fully compliant with HOA regulations and that he had done nothing to warrant suspicion. He reminded them calmly that while he respected their role, they had no authority to demand entry or intimidate him. The officers shifted uneasily, realizing that they were dealing with someone who not only understood the law, but also knew how to assert his rights firmly and respectfully. Karen appeared soon after, striding across the street with a determined look. She pointed at the cabin and began speaking loudly, her voice carrying through the quiet neighborhood. She demanded that the officers handle the situation and ensure the retired officer followed the rules. But the retired officer didn't flinch. He stood tall, his posture confident, and continued speaking calmly to the security guards. He reiterated that any action needed to follow legal procedures and that harassment would not be tolerated. As the tension mounted, he subtly hinted at his background in law enforcement. He didn't boast or threaten, but he made it clear that he was no ordinary resident. This knowledge seemed to rattle both the guards and Karen. They had expected an easy confrontation, someone who might panic or apologize for imaginary infractions. Instead, they were facing a calm, composed man who understood his rights and knew how to handle confrontation. He reached for his phone, not in anger but as a precaution, recording the encounter in case things escalated. He also quietly contacted a friend, another retired officer, to be nearby. Not for a fight but for safety and documentation. He understood the value of support, and having someone nearby would prevent unnecessary conflict. His friend, familiar with the retired officer's methods, agreed to be on standby, arriving discreetly without drawing attention. The retired officer continued to speak with the security guards, explaining the proper way HOA concerns should be handled. He emphasized mutual respect and the importance of following legal procedures. His voice was calm but firm, each word measured to maintain control over the situation. The officers were visibly uncomfortable, their confidence waning. Karen's frustration grew as she realized that her authority and attempts at intimidation were failing. She waved her arms and shouted, but her actions seemed almost comical in the face of his calm composure. Neighbors began to notice the commotion from their homes. Some peeked out of their windows, others came closer to see what was happening. Whispers spread quickly as people watched the retired officer handle the situation with dignity and control. It became clear to everyone observing that Karen's approach was over the top and unjustified. The retired officer's calm, methodical handling of the confrontation earned him respect from onlookers who had previously been wary of the situation. He didn't allow emotions to take over. Anger or frustration could have escalated the situation, but he relied on patience and experience. He knew when to speak and when to remain silent, letting the guards and Karen reveal their own insecurities. This method of calm assertion had served him well throughout his career, and now it worked perfectly in this neighborhood conflict. Each time Karen tried to interrupt or escalate, he responded with a composed statement, reinforcing the boundaries of his property and rights. As the morning turned to afternoon, the guards grew increasingly uncertain. They realized that they were in over their heads and that any aggressive action could have serious consequences. The retired officer's subtle references to legal protections and his background made them hesitant to continue. Karen, realizing that her plan to intimidate had failed, began pacing angrily, muttering under her breath. Her attempts to pressure the guards became awkward and ineffective. The retired officer remained steady, occasionally glancing at his garden and taking slow sips of coffee. He wanted to show that he was unbothered, that he was focused on his life and peace rather than her attempts to create chaos. His calm presence was a powerful statement in itself. By remaining composed and in control, he shifted the power dynamic entirely, making it clear that he would not be bullied or manipulated. At one point, he invited the guards to walk around the perimeter of the property, ensuring them that they could observe everything without crossing any lines. He spoke politely, guiding them step by step, making sure the process was transparent but controlled. The guards reluctantly followed, unsure how to behave. Karen, meanwhile, hovered at a distance, still angry and frustrated, realizing that her attempts to assert authority were ineffective. By the end of the afternoon, the retired officer had established his dominance through calm, measured behavior. He had communicated clearly that his property and rights were protected, that any action needed proper authority, and that harassment would not be tolerated. Karen eventually left, muttering threats under her breath, while the security guards quietly departed, understanding that they had overstepped. The retired officer watched them leave from his porch, feeling a quiet sense of accomplishment. He hadn't needed to raise his voice, act aggressively, or escalate the situation. He had relied on patience, experience, and clear communication. The woods were peaceful again, and the air felt lighter. He returned to his garden, tending to his plants and appreciating the calm beauty of the surroundings. He knew this was just one of many challenges that could arise in a neighborhood, but he also knew that his training, instincts, and wisdom would guide him through any future conflict. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the trees, the retired officer sat on his porch reflecting on the day. The peace of the cabin, the quiet of the forest, and the simple joy of his garden brought him comfort. He had faced the confrontation with composure and intelligence, preserving his solitude and asserting his rights without unnecessary conflict. And in that moment he felt truly at home, confident that his life in the cabin was exactly where he was meant to be. The next morning the retired officer woke to another quiet dawn, the forest around his cabin still and calm. He enjoyed this early solitude, sipping hot coffee while sitting on the porch, the aroma of pine and earth mixing with the scent of his brew. Life here was simple and peaceful, a sharp contrast to his days in the city where sirens, chaos, and danger were constant companions. He had spent decades serving the community in ways that demanded courage and patience, and now in retirement, he sought the rewards of quiet reflection and self-care. But his peace, he knew, could be challenged at any time. As he tended to his garden, trimming overgrown leaves and watering the vegetables, he noticed movement from the edge of his property. Two figures emerged from the trees near the road. They were the same security guards from the previous days, slowly approaching, their demeanor cautious but determined. The retired officer paused, straightening up, his instincts immediately alert. He knew that confrontations were rarely accidental, and that these men were here for a reason, though perhaps not the one Karen had imagined. He took a deep breath, maintaining a calm exterior. The security guards walked up to his gate, their uniforms neat, but their hesitance was obvious. The taller one spoke first, introducing themselves and stating that they were sent by the HOA to inspect the property following complaints. The retired officer nodded, listening carefully. He knew their statements were vague, intentionally so, designed to make him uneasy, but his years in law enforcement had trained him to recognize bluff and posturing. He didn't flinch. Calmly, he invited the guards to step onto his porch. He didn't rush, didn't demand anything. His composure spoke louder than words. He asked them politely but firmly to explain the complaints in detail. The guards stumbled through their explanation, admitting they had no specific evidence of violations, only reports from Karen alleging suspicious behavior and potential rule-breaking. The retired officer's eyes narrowed slightly, his voice measured, reminding them that compliance with HOA rules did not equate to permission for harassment or intimidation. His tone was even, professional, and utterly controlled. Across the street, Karen appeared, arms crossed and frowning, clearly frustrated that the retired officer had not been rattled. She called out, demanding that they take action immediately, but he didn't respond to her shouting. Instead, he continued addressing the security guards directly, reinforcing boundaries and clarifying his rights. He reminded them that any legal authority they might claim required proper documentation, and that they needed to conduct themselves within the law. His words were calm, deliberate, and clear, designed to diffuse tension while asserting authority. The security guards shifted uneasily. They were used to citizens cowering or reacting emotionally, not a retired officer who could read situations like an open book. His background was apparent in his posture, his precise speech, and the way he remained composed even as Karen's yelling escalated. At one point, he subtly mentioned that he had decades of experience in law enforcement, not to intimidate, but to make sure they understood that their actions were being closely observed and evaluated. The effect was immediate. Their confidence waned, and they became cautious, tiptoeing around the conversation like unsure students. Knowing the importance of documentation, he began recording the interaction on his phone. His camera was angled to capture the approach of the security guards and Karen's actions, ensuring a record for clarity and safety. He was careful to keep his movements natural, unthreatening, and professional. This was not about confrontation. It was about protecting himself, his property, and his rights. Every step was intentional, demonstrating control and foresight honed over decades of service. He also reached out discreetly to a trusted friend, another retired officer, who could arrive nearby if the situation escalated. His friend understood the retired officer's approach, calm, non-aggressive, and focused on de-escalation. Backup was not meant for conflict. It was insurance against unexpected escalation, and a show of solidarity that often diffused tension before it grew. Karen, growing increasingly irritated, tried to assert authority over the guards. She pointed at the cabin and demanded action, using her voice as if volume could replace legitimacy. The retired officer didn't respond directly to her. Instead, he maintained a neutral focus, calmly guiding the security guards on how to inspect the property properly. He emphasized transparency and cooperation without crossing legal boundaries. Each suggestion he made reinforced his control and demonstrated that any attempt to intimidate him would fail. The security guards, sensing the growing tension and the retired officer's knowledge, became even more hesitant. They whispered to each other, uncertain how to proceed. Karen's face turned red with frustration as her plan unraveled in real time. She had assumed authority, relying on intimidation, not realizing that she was facing someone who had spent a lifetime managing far more dangerous situations. Her shouting began to lose effect. Neighbors began to notice and watch quietly, intrigued by the calm, methodical way the retired officer was handling the situation. He guided the guards through the property, pointing out details, showing that everything was in order, and reinforcing that he had nothing to hide. His tone was polite, professional, and firm. He avoided any sarcasm or confrontation, knowing that the effectiveness of his approach lay in composure. Karen's presence became less influential as he focused on direct interaction with the guards, controlling the situation and redirecting it away from unnecessary drama. As the inspection concluded, the guards visibly relaxed, recognizing that they had no legitimate cause for intervention. The retired officer had maintained control throughout, ensuring safety, legality, and respect. He had handled the situation without aggression, without escalating tension, and with a clear focus on fairness and integrity. Karen, now standing at the edge of her patience, realized that her efforts had been ineffective. She was frustrated but powerless in this context, her attempts to dominate the situation thwarted by calm expertise. The retired officer then spoke directly to the guards, reminding them of the importance of procedure and professional conduct. He emphasized that any further complaints should be handled formally, respecting both HOA rules and legal boundaries. The guards nodded, understanding that they had been part of a poorly managed attempt at intimidation, and that further attempts needed careful handling. Karen, realizing the situation had slipped from her control, began pacing angrily and muttering under her breath. The retired officer maintained a neutral stance, continuing to record as a precaution and remaining fully composed. The forest around the cabin remained quiet, almost as if supporting him in his calm assertion. His focus returned to the beauty of his surroundings, the garden and the tranquility of the woods, demonstrating that his peace was not easily disturbed. By late afternoon, the security guards and Karen left the vicinity, their authority undermined by the retired officer's composed, confident handling of the situation. He watched them go, acknowledging the resolution quietly. His demeanor remained calm, but internally he felt satisfaction at successfully asserting his rights without confrontation. He had relied on skill, experience, and patience rather than aggression. Sitting on his porch, sipping coffee as the sun began to set, he reflected on the encounter. He realized that patience, preparation, and knowledge were his greatest tools. By remaining calm and strategic, he had protected his home and dignity. The peaceful atmosphere returned, the forest sounds filling the silence. The retired officer smiled quietly, reassured by the fact that he had handled an unexpected challenge with grace, proving that calm confidence often outshines aggression or authority when properly applied. As twilight descended, the retired officer felt a renewed sense of security and satisfaction. He returned to his garden, checking the plants, trimming leaves, and appreciating the quiet around him. Life at the cabin was about simple pleasures, and he knew that while challenges might arise, his experience, calm demeanor, and careful planning would always see him through. The peace of the forest surrounded him. The warmth of the setting sun bathed the cabin in golden light, and he felt truly at home, prepared for whatever might come next. The following day began with the usual calm that the retired officer had grown to cherish. Sunlight streamed through the trees, casting patterns on the wooden porch of his cabin. He brewed a cup of coffee and took a moment to breathe in the fresh forest air. The events of the last few days weighed lightly on his mind, but he knew he had to remain vigilant. Even the smallest spark of conflict could flare if left unchecked. He spent the morning tending to his garden, trimming overgrown herbs, and checking on the vegetables. He enjoyed these moments, the slow and deliberate work, knowing that care and patience yielded results over time. The forest around him was alive with subtle sounds, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of a bird, the gentle hum of insects. It was the kind of peace he had waited years to find, and he was determined not to let anyone disturb it unnecessarily. Around mid-morning, he noticed movement near the road again. A car slowed as it passed his cabin, and he caught a glimpse of Karen inside, her expression frustrated but determined. She was driving slowly, making it clear she was observing him. The retired officer did not react impulsively. He remained composed, recognizing that her presence alone was an attempt at intimidation. He had dealt with far more dangerous situations in his career and knew how to manage tension without escalating it. Shortly after, the two security guards returned, this time approaching cautiously, aware of the dynamic they had witnessed over the past days. The retired officer met them on the porch, his posture relaxed but confident. He greeted them politely and asked them to explain the reason for their return. They mumbled something about continued HOA oversight and unspecified complaints. He listened attentively, nodding slowly, giving them space to explain, but making it clear through his tone and presence that any overreach would not be tolerated. He subtly reminded the guards of proper procedure and legal boundaries, emphasizing that respect for residents' rights was paramount. He maintained a calm, professional demeanor, ensuring that no unnecessary conflict arose. The guards' unease was evident. They were not accustomed to encountering someone who could assert authority so calmly, while simultaneously guiding the interaction. Karen, observing from a distance, was growing increasingly agitated, her attempts to assert dominance faltering in the face of his composure. The retired officer also discreetly contacted his friend, another retired officer, asking him to arrive nearby for support if needed. The purpose was not confrontation but safety and backup documentation. He knew that even minor disputes could escalate if not managed with care, and he valued the presence of a trusted ally who could intervene if necessary. As the conversation with the security guards continued, the retired officer decided to take proactive measures. He invited the guards to walk the perimeter of his property, showing them that everything was in order and fully compliant with HOA rules. His tone was calm and measured, demonstrating transparency without aggression. He provided detailed explanations of his actions, his property maintenance, and his adherence to rules, ensuring that no misunderstanding could occur. The guards followed, their movements hesitant, realizing that they were observing a man who was both confident and knowledgeable. Karen, seeing that her influence over the situation was weakening, attempted to escalate the situation verbally. She shouted across the street demanding immediate action, gesturing angrily and pointing at the cabin. The retired officer ignored her theatrics, focusing instead on the security guards. By addressing them directly, he maintained control over the interaction and minimized the impact of Karen's disruptive behavior. Throughout the morning, the retired officer continued to demonstrate calm authority. He explained the proper process for handling complaints, emphasizing that HOA actions must respect legal boundaries. He reassured the guards that he had no intention of causing conflict, but expected professionalism and proper conduct. His tone was firm yet polite, his gestures measured and his presence commanding. By doing so, he turned a potential confrontation into a controlled and respectful interaction. The neighbors, who had been observing from a distance, began to whisper among themselves. They noted how the retired officer handled the situation with dignity, patience, and intelligence. His calm demeanor contrasted sharply with Karen's loud, frustrated attempts at authority. Slowly, the realization spread that the retired officer's approach was far more effective than aggression or intimidation. He had taken control not by force but by composure, clear communication, and strategic thinking. As the inspection concluded, the retired officer guided the security guards back to the gate, ensuring they understood the importance of proper procedure and respectful conduct. He emphasized that any further action should be formal and documented, reinforcing the boundaries that Karen had attempted to overstep. The guards nodded, visibly relieved to leave, their confidence restored by the structured and professional interaction. Karen, seeing the outcome, grew increasingly frustrated. She muttered under her breath, pacing along the street, but her influence had already been diminished. The retired officer remained composed, recording the interaction subtly for his own records. He knew that documentation was crucial for protecting himself and maintaining accountability. By staying calm and strategic, he had maintained his property's security and his personal peace. The afternoon passed quietly, and the retired officer returned to his routine. He inspected his garden, tended to the plants, and appreciated the subtle beauty of the forest around him. The sun began to dip, casting long shadows across the cabin and filling the woods with warm golden light. He sat on the porch sipping coffee, reflecting on the events of the day. He felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. He had handled a potentially stressful and confrontational situation with skill and dignity, preserving his rights and peace without unnecessary conflict. As the light faded, he realized the importance of preparation, patience, and measured action. His experience in law enforcement had taught him that control, calm, and strategic thinking were often more effective than aggression or anger. He understood the value of documenting interactions, maintaining transparency, and involving trusted allies when necessary. Each of these strategies had allowed him to navigate the conflict with Karen and the security guards successfully. As evening settled in, the retired officer reflected on the broader lessons of the encounter. Life in the cabin was meant to be peaceful and restorative, yet he understood that challenges could arise at any time. He knew that maintaining composure, clear communication, and respect for boundaries was key to protecting both his property and his personal well-being. The forest, the garden, and the quiet moments on the porch were rewards for his patience and diligence. He felt reassured that he could handle future challenges with the same calm authority. Night descended quietly over the cabin. The sounds of the forest became more pronounced. The chirping of crickets, the distant calls of nocturnal birds, and the rustle of leaves in the gentle wind. The retired officer sat in his chair, a blanket over his shoulders, reflecting on the events of the past few days. He had faced attempts at intimidation and managed them with grace and intelligence. His property was secure, his rights respected, and his peace largely intact. He felt a renewed sense of confidence and calm, knowing that his approach had been effective and that he could continue living his life on his own terms. The retired officer went inside his cabin, preparing a simple dinner and enjoying the quiet of the evening. The conflict with Karen and the security guards had reinforced lessons he had known for years. Patience, experience, calm authority, and strategic thinking were powerful tools in maintaining control and ensuring respect. As he settled into his routine, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. He had handled the challenges of the day without aggression, preserved his peace, and reinforced the boundaries of his property. In that moment, the cabin felt like home in the truest sense, a place of safety, reflection, and quiet triumph.